He thought he could sneak away with her, a secret bottle in hand, never imagining the trap I had set. That night, what was meant to stay hidden ended up on full display, and firefighters literally had to pull them apart while the whole town watched. His secret unraveled, and my life shifted forever. My name is Emily. I'm a wife, a planner, someone who believed in the rhythm of my life, our life. 8 years of routines, laughter, quiet mornings, and simple evenings. But that night showed me what I was capable of when the person I trusted most turned my world upside down. Stay with me as I take you through every twist, the quiet signs I ignored, the shocking discoveries, and the moment that changed everything. If this story keeps you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this. And if you're watching from somewhere special, drop your location in the comments. I'd love to see where this story is reaching.
8 years can build a world between two people. Mine with Chris began in the most ordinary ways: coffee in the morning, dinners at night, and the kind of small routines that make a house feel like home. When I look back now, those details play in my mind like scenes from a film, some sharp and bright, others fading at the edges. Chris always woke first. I'd hear the floor creak in the hallway, the clink of a spoon against a mug, the slow drip of the coffee maker. By the time I came into the kitchen, he'd already be leaning against the counter, phone in one hand, mug in the other. He had this habit of pouring far too much sugar into his cup. The spoon rattled 3, sometimes 4 times before he stopped. I teased him every morning. "You like coffee with your sugar?" I'd ask, sliding mix to him. "Adds character," he'd answer, sipping with a smug grin. It was such a silly ritual, but I came to count on it. A sign that no matter what the day brought, we started together. He left for work with the same gesture every morning, a quick kiss on my forehead. Not rushed, but practiced, like a promise that he'd come back in the evening. Sometimes he forgot his tie or the folder he needed, and I'd run to the door calling after him. He'd laugh, take it from my hand, and say, "You save me more than you know." Those small words stayed with me, long after the sound of his car faded down the street. Our evenings carried another ritual: his call on the way home. I would put dinner on the stove and place my phone on the counter, waiting for it to light up. The moment it rang, I felt the house warm.
"How bad is traffic?" I'd ask as soon as I picked up. "Terrible, same as yesterday." "Then you left too late again." And he'd laugh. His voice filled the kitchen while I stirred pasta or chopped vegetables, and by the time he walked through the front door, the day felt stitched together again. Sundays were our grocery day. Chris insisted on pushing the cart, pretending it was some sort of race car. I'd walk ahead, shaking my head, while he zoomed around corners. Without fail, a chocolate bar always found its way into the basket. He never admitted to it. "Must have jumped in," he'd say, holding back a smile. We weren't without flaws. Arguments came, of course. Sometimes about bills, other times about who forgot to take the trash out. But Chris had a way of softening the sharp edges. He'd let me vent, then come over, place his arms around me, and say, "Don't let small things eat at us." I usually caved. He knew how to break the tension. For years, I thought that rhythm was proof of us, proof of love, proof of trust. But rhythms can falter in ways that are almost invisible at first. It began with silence. One Thursday evening, I was setting the table when I noticed my phone hadn't buzzed. No call. I checked the clock. Then I checked the phone again. By the time I heard his car in the driveway, the knot in my chest had already formed. "Traffic?" I asked when he walked in. "Yeah, bad," he said, dropping his keys in the bowl and walking past me to the stairs. No smile, no laugh. It unsettled me, but I brushed it aside. One night, it meant nothing. The next week, it happened again. No call. He came home later. muttering something about meetings. I followed him into the kitchen. "Want to eat? I kept dinner warm," I said. "Not hungry. I'll shower first." His tone was clipped, final. He didn't look at me. I told myself work was weighing on him, stress, pressure, the kind of things that pull a person away for a while. But it didn't stop there. Our Sunday trips grew shorter. He stopped pushing the cart with his silly race car routine. The chocolate never appeared. He walked down aisles distracted, checking his phone. When I asked about it, he waved me off. "Just work, don't worry." At dinner, I tried to start conversations. "Want to watch that new show tonight?" "Not in the mood." "How is your day?" "Same as always." One evening, I carried plates to the table and found him already sunk into the couch, scrolling on his phone. I sat beside him. "Let's eat before it gets cold." "Go ahead, I'll join in a bit," he muttered, eyes fixed on the screen. I ate alone. The gap widened, quietly, in small moments. Missed calls turned into no calls at all. Excuses about late meetings piled higher. His laughter grew rare, replaced with sighs and silence. I tried to reach him. One night, I pressed my hand over his as he flipped through channels. "Chris, talk to me. What's going on?" "Nothing. You're making it bigger than it is." His hand slipped out from under mine, and he turned up the volume. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think he'd come back to the man I knew, the man who stole chocolate bars, who laughed at his own bad jokes, who called me every evening without fail. So I kept waiting. But each day, the distance between us stretched further, and I was the only one still reaching out. Our 8th anniversary came. I set the table with candles, made his favorite dish, and even pulled out the wine we had been saving. He walked in later than expected, eyes heavy, shoulders slumped. "Happy anniversary," I said softly, stepping toward him with a smile. "Oh, right," he muttered, loosening his tie. He sat, ate quickly, barely touching the wine. Halfway through the meal, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, pushed his chair back, and said, "I need to take this." He didn't return for 15 minutes. I sat staring at the melting wax of the candles, the untouched wine, the food going cold. When he came back, he offered a half-hearted smile. "Sorry, work." The word felt like a wall. I forced a smile in return. "It's fine." But it wasn't. Nights grew colder. Even when he lay beside me, I felt alone. He turned his back, scrolled through his phone until the screen glared into the darkness. I lay awake, listening to the soft clicks, wondering what was more important than us. On weekends, he left the house more often. "Errands," he said, "work stuff." He gave no details, and when I asked if I could come along, he brushed it off. One Saturday morning, I tried again. "Let's go to the lake. It's been months." "Can't. Too much to do." "Just for a couple of hours. We used to go all the time." "Not today," he said sharply, pulling his jacket on. He didn't kiss me goodbye. I stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the road. That was how the cracks formed. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in slow, silent shifts. The man who once filled my days with laughter now filled them with distance. The man who once made the ordinary feel safe now made it feel uncertain. I still tried. I cooked his favorite meals. I asked about his day. I left notes in his briefcase, little reminders of us. Most went unanswered. Some didn't even get a glance. The silence grew heavier. The house that once felt warm began to echo. And though I didn't know it yet, those quiet nights were only the beginning of something much darker. Silence has a weight to it. It doesn't just fill a room. It presses on you, makes you notice what's missing. For me, it started with a quiet phone that once lit up every evening without fail. At first, it was just one night. I stood in the kitchen, chopping onions for dinner, glancing at the counter where my phone sat. 6 o'clock came, then 6:15, then 6:30. No call. I wiped my hands on a towel and checked the screen anyway, convinced I might have missed it. Nothing. By the time I heard his key in the lock, my chest felt tight. I forced a smile as he walked in. "Traffic?" I asked, voice light. "Yeah, bad," he muttered. Setting his bag down, he kissed my cheek quickly and headed upstairs without another word. I watched him go, the silence in the house stretching long after his footsteps faded. The next day, I told myself not to overthink it. Work could get busy. Maybe he'd been tired. But when it happened again, the excuse didn't land as easily. That Thursday, I left my phone on the counter again, waiting for his call. Dinner simmered on the stove. The house felt too still, too watchful. 6 came, 6:30, 7. Still nothing. When the door finally opened, I said, "You didn't call." He shrugged. I was driving, didn't feel like talking. The words stung more than I let on. Talking to me had been his habit, his comfort. Now it was a burden. I set plates on the table quietly, listening to the scrape of his chair, the clink of his fork, the silence between us. That silence became a pattern. One night became 3. 3 became a week. Soon I realized I was holding my phone out of habit, waiting for a call that no longer came. The first Saturday of his silence, I decided to test it. I didn't message him all day. I wanted to see if he'd reach out on his own. The hours passed, morning into afternoon, afternoon into evening. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, and my own thoughts. Finally, I sent him a text. "Where are you?" 15 minutes later, he replied, "Out. Be home later." No detail, no warmth, just 3 words that landed like a door closing in my face. When he walked through the door that night, I asked softly, "Out where?" "Nowhere special," he answered, slipping past me to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it in one long gulp, then went upstairs. I stood in the hallway staring after him, the question still hanging in the air. Silence doesn't just mean no sound. It means no explanation, no reassurance. It was the silence that told me more than his words ever could. The silence said he was pulling away. The silence said he was hiding something. One evening, I set 2 plates of food on the table and called upstairs. "Dinner's ready." No answer. 10 minutes passed. I went to the stairs and called again. Still nothing. Finally, I climbed halfway up and found him sitting on the bed, phone in hand, screen glowing in the dim light. "You didn't hear me?" I asked. He startled, glanced up, then forced a smile. "Sorry, lost track of time." I looked at the phone, then at him. Must have been important. He turned the screen over and set it on the nightstand. Work. That word had become his shield. Work. Always work. I nodded, but inside, the doubt had already rooted itself. The next week, I decided to watch closer. I noticed how he angled his phone away when I walked into the room, how he set it face down on the table, how he carried it into the bathroom, into the shower, never leaving it behind. That wasn't work. That was something else. One night, while he showered, I glanced at the screen as it lit up. A message flashed, only for a second, but long enough for me to catch 2 words. "Can't wait." My chest tightened. I didn't see who it was from. The message disappeared, replaced by the lock screen. When he came back into the room, towel draped over his shoulders, I forced myself to act normal. He smiled faintly, as if testing me. "You look tired," he said. "Long day," I replied, though my eyes kept flicking to the phone. He slid it into his pocket without a word. That silence between us grew thicker, heavier. It wasn't just absence anymore. It was a warning. I started listening in ways I never had before.
The way he sighed when I asked simple questions. The way he smiled at his phone, but rarely at me. The way his excuses came quicker, sharper, less convincing. One evening, I stood by the window waiting for his car to pull into the driveway. The clock ticked past 7, then 8. I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. "Where are you?" I asked. "Still at the office. Don't wait up." I looked out at the quiet street. "You usually call when you're late." "I'm busy," he snapped, then quickly softened his tone. "I'll explain later." He didn't. When he finally came home after 10, he kissed me on the cheek, his lips cold. He smelled faintly of cologne, not his usual kind. I asked how work had gone. He said, "Fine." Then he went upstairs. I stayed at the table alone, staring at the empty plate across from me. It was in the silence that I first knew something was wrong. Not in what he said, but in what he didn't speak. The words he didn't speak, the calls he didn't make, the warmth he didn't give.
Silence filled the house like a third presence. I could feel it between us at dinner, in the car, in bed at night. It pressed against me, whispered questions I didn't want to face. And though I didn't have proof yet, I understood this much. Silence was never empty. It meant there was something I wasn't supposed to hear, something waiting just beyond my reach. That was the first sign of the life I thought I had beginning to unravel. The silence had already told me something was wrong, but silence alone doesn't prove anything. It gnaws at you, whispers in your ear, makes you doubt, but it leaves you reaching for more. The truth revealed itself in fragments, small pieces scattered across our days, each one sharper than the last. The first piece came in the form of a text. He was in the shower, steam rising under the bathroom door, when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, I ignored it. That night, I didn't. I glanced. A name I didn't recognize appeared, along with the message, "Can't wait for tonight, heart." My hands froze. The phone locked again, the glow fading into black, but those words stayed burning in my mind. I stood there until I heard the water shut off, then quickly stepped away. When he came out, towels slung low on his hips, he gave me a smile that felt too easy. He picked up the phone, glanced at it, and slipped it into his pocket. "Long day," he said, almost casually. I nodded. My throat felt dry. "Yeah, long." Neither of us mentioned the message, but I didn't forget it. The next clue came not from his phone, but from his wallet. One evening, as I gathered laundry, I found his pants crumpled on the floor. I reached into the pocket to empty them and pulled out a folded receipt. It was from a hotel barely 10 miles from our house. 1 night stay, standard room. The date matched one of the evenings he claimed to be working late. My heart pounded as I unfolded it, staring at the numbers. The paper shook in my hands. For a moment, I thought about confronting him immediately, throwing it at him, demanding an explanation. But I didn't. Instead, I folded it again, slipped it into the back of my drawer, and stayed silent. I needed more than suspicion. That night when he came home, I asked, "How is work?" He said, "Busy, exhausting. Why?"
"No reason," I replied, forcing a smile. He didn't notice the tremor in my voice. Days passed, each one tightening the knot inside me. I watched him more closely. I noticed the way he checked his phone with quick, secret glances, the way he typed with a half smile when he thought I wasn't looking. Then came the moment that shattered doubt completely. Another receipt. This one wasn't hidden. It slipped from his pocket when he tossed his jacket over the chair. I picked it up, intending to place it back, but my eyes caught the words printed clearly across the paper. Personal care store. One item. A bottle of lubricant. We had never used anything like that together. Not once in 8 years.
I stared at the slip in my hand until the numbers blurred. A wave of heat rushed through me. Anger, humiliation, disbelief, all crashing at once. It was so small, just a strip of paper, but it carried more weight than anything he had ever said. When Chris came back into the room, I held it behind my back. He looked at me, unaware. "What's for dinner?" he asked. My voice caught in my throat. "I haven't decided yet." I slipped the receipt into my pocket and turned away. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing. My mind replayed the pieces. The text message, the hotel receipt, the bottle of lube. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with the glow from the streetlights outside. Anger pulsed through me, hot and sharp. But beneath it was something else, a kind of clarity. The truth no longer felt hidden. It was right in front of me, undeniable. And as I lay there, I thought, this isn't going to break me. Not this. If anything, it sharpened me, made me see the man beside me for who he really was, made me understand that the silence hadn't been empty, it had been filled with lies.
The next morning, Chris acted as though nothing had changed. He kissed my forehead, grabbed his coffee, and left for work with the same routine he always had. He didn't notice the way I watched him, didn't see how my eyes lingered a little too long. When the door closed, I pulled the receipt from my pocket again. The ink smudged slightly where my fingers had pressed too tightly. I read it once more, then tucked it away with the others. Proof. Evidence, fragments of truth. I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. The anger burned inside me, but it was controlled, quiet, waiting. In the days that followed, I carried those pieces with me like stones in my pocket. Heavy, constant, unshakable. When he laughed at his phone, I saw the heart emoji. When he came home late, I saw the hotel receipt. When he brushed past me, indifferent, I felt the weight of that lube bottle he'd bought for someone else. He thought I didn't know. He thought he was clever. But the more he hid, the clearer it all became to me. And somewhere in that silence, in those discoveries, something shifted inside me. I stopped clinging to hope. I stopped waiting for him to return to the man he once was. I began to plan, not with screams or accusations, but with patience. Because if he thought I would simply collapse under the weight of his lies, he was wrong. The truth hadn't crushed me. It had sharpened me. And I was ready to use that sharpness. By now, I knew the pieces. The text messages, the hotel stays, the lube receipt. Together, they told a story that no longer needed explanation. Chris was living a life beside me I hadn't been invited into. And while my first reaction was a knot of anger and humiliation, I felt a strange clarity begin to settle over me. I began watching him differently, not with suspicion exactly, but with focus. Every movement, every habit became a detail I cataloged in my mind. The first discovery came almost by accident. One weekend, while he was at work, I went to the garage to fetch the old toolboxes we had stacked on shelves. His jacket was hanging on a hook. I noticed a small drawer beneath some paperwork. It was inconspicuous, tucked behind a box of seasonal decorations, almost invisible unless you knew it was there. Curiosity pulled me closer. The drawer clicked open smoothly, revealing its contents. A small collection of bottles, personal care items, and other things he had kept secret. Nothing overtly shocking at first glance, but familiar enough to tell me this was where he kept his private habits, and among them, the bottle from the receipt I had found earlier. The sight made my heart beat faster. Here it was, the proof, the object of his deceit lying in plain sight. The drawer held more than I expected, and yet it was so carefully hidden, so deliberate, that I realized how much thought he had put into keeping this separate from the life we shared. I closed it quietly,
listening for sounds from the house. The secret was out, but only in my mind. He didn't know. Not yet. I spent the next few days observing without touching. I noticed patterns. When he left for work, he sometimes paused in the bedroom, glanced at the drawer as if confirming it was locked, before heading out. He never mentioned it. He never acknowledged it. But the rhythm of his secrecy was clear. I asked myself the same questions over and over. Should I leave? Should I scream? Should I confront him in the moment and demand answers? Or should I wait, watch, and make him face the consequences in a way he never expected? Each option carried weight. Leaving would be the safest, the cleanest, but it didn't satisfy the urge to reclaim some measure of control. Confronting him immediately might feel satisfying, but it risked losing the advantage I had gathered in silence. Patience, I realized, could become its own weapon. I began to plan with care, each step calculated. Timing mattered. I couldn't act when emotions were raw, when the risk of mistakes was high. I needed a moment when he believed he was untouchable, when his confidence in secrecy was at its peak. I watched him pack the drawer with the same precision he had always displayed. I noted the times he left, the nights he went out, and the small habits that might betray him. Each detail became a part of the plan. I made small tests. One evening, I moved the bottle slightly, just to see if he noticed. He didn't. He picked it up, carried it to the bathroom, and left it untouched for the night. Confidence, arrogance, the perfect conditions. I mapped out the week. Which nights he claimed to work late, which nights he left his phone unattended. I considered every variable. The plan was simple in principle. Wait for the right moment, replace the object with something irreversible, and let nature take its course. The internal conflict was persistent. Sitting alone in the living room, I asked myself again and again, should I leave this life behind entirely? Should I let the anger consume me and act in the heat of the moment? Or should I wait? Waiting was harder than acting. Every day I saw him through a lens sharpened by knowledge. I could sense the lies even in his casual gestures, the way he laughed a little too softly at his phone, the way he ducked his eyes when I entered the room. It all built tension inside me, a slow coil tightening, demanding release. But acting without precision would ruin it. Acting without strategy would reduce my control. I wanted him to understand in a way he couldn't ignore. I wanted consequences that matched the weight of what he had done. And so, I waited.
I also watched myself in this process. It was strange to see the calm develop in me. The initial heat of anger had transformed into focus. I noticed how my hands moved, the way I rehearsed actions in my mind, the steady rhythm of breathing I used to keep from tipping over into chaos. I became meticulous. I made sure no one in the house would notice the movement of my hands, the shifting of objects, the way I opened drawers only when he was far away. Every choice required patience. Every glance at him had to be measured. I practiced routines in my head. How to remove the bottle, how to replace it, how to seal it back in a way that would go unnoticed until it was too late. Timing mattered more than speed. I rehearsed the sequence over and over while he occupied other rooms, imagining how he would move, how he would react, how the night would unfold. Evenings became the most important part of the plan. He would come home tired, confident, unaware. I would make sure the house was quiet, the lights low, the distractions minimal. The conditions had to be perfect. If anything went wrong, if he suspected, the effect would be lost. I observed how he prepared for the night. He believed he was sneaky. The drawer would be checked, the object selected, the sequence of his movements practiced. I knew exactly where he would place his belongings, how he would move around the house. I could predict every step.
It was almost like a game, a dangerous game, but one where I held the advantage. The internal debate persisted. I pictured walking away entirely, leaving him to his choices. That would have been the simplest path. It would have been easy to step outside and leave the past behind, to take the fragments of trust I had left and rebuild my life elsewhere. But a part of me wanted him to face the weight of his actions in a way he could not ignore. I didn't want to destroy him, not truly. I wanted clarity. I wanted the moment when he realized the consequences of living a double life. And patience was the key. Every day I reinforced that patience. I watched him interact with me, with his phone, with his routines. I noted every slip, every small indication of carelessness. Each observation strengthened my understanding.
Then came the night I finally decided the timing was right. He had claimed to work late again, completely unsuspecting. I had moved items in the drawer carefully, making space for the switch. I had rehearsed the sequence repeatedly, ensuring that when I acted, no mistake would betray my plan. I checked the house one last time. The rooms were empty, silent, safe. He was on his way out, confident in his secrecy. I felt the pulse of clarity in my chest, the calm that comes from knowing you have control in a situation where chaos might otherwise reign. For the first time, I allowed a small, private smile. The moment was coming. I had waited, observed, calculated. I had fought the urge to act rashly, resisted the temptation to confront him immediately, and in that careful, quiet process, I discovered something about myself. I was stronger than I had realized, sharper, focused, patient. The plan was no longer just about him. It was about proving to myself that I could take the pieces of my life and handle them with precision. I could watch, wait, and act in a way that demanded attention. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to leave yet. I didn't need to act out of heat or emotion. Patience was enough. And in that patience, I felt a strange sense of power. Not power over him, exactly. Not in the way anger gives you sudden bursts that fade quickly. This was deeper, steady, sure. When he walked out that night, unaware of the eyes following his every move, I was ready. Not yet, not quite, but soon. The switch would come, and it would be perfect. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so, the kind of stillness that makes a house feel smaller, each creak and tick amplified in the darkness. Chris had claimed to be working late again. The excuse sounded routine, believable, late meetings, deadlines, but I didn't need it to be convincing. I had waited for this moment, and the house was empty enough to act without interruption. I moved through the room slowly, deliberately. Every step was calculated. The living room was dark, the curtains drawn. The faint glow from the street lamp outside slanted across the floor, highlighting the dust motes that floated like tiny specters in the air. I paused for a moment, listening. No sound came from upstairs, no car in the driveway, just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the quiet pulse of my own heartbeat. The drawer was waiting, hidden behind boxes in the garage, inconspicuous, just as I had discovered it weeks ago. I knelt in front of it, my hands hovering for a brief moment before finally making contact. The wood was cool under my fingers. I opened the drawer, exposing the collection inside. The bottle, among other items, neat and unassuming, oblivious to what was about to happen. I picked up the bottle carefully, holding it in my hands. Its smooth plastic surface reflected the faint light, and for a moment it looked innocuous, almost mundane.
I shook it gently, hearing the liquid inside. My heart thumped in my chest, but my hands remained steady. This was a deliberate act. Every motion mattered. With a small, controlled movement, I unscrewed the cap and poured the contents into a container I had prepared in advance. The liquid pooled in the bottom, catching the light, vanishing into the shadowed glass. I discarded the bottle, but the replacement was ready. Clear industrial glue, thick, viscous, unyielding once it dried. I had chosen it deliberately, knowing its permanence. I held the new bottle, watching the way the light played across the liquid. It seemed alive in my hands, holding the power to turn his confidence into chaos. I replaced the original bottle with the glue carefully, checking that it fit perfectly in the drawer, aligned with the other items, as if nothing had changed. It was seamless, invisible, waiting.
The act itself was quiet, no shouting, no drama, just the small sound of the cap twisting back into place, the faint click as the drawers slid shut. I lingered for a moment, my fingertips brushing the wood, the hush of the garage pressing in on me. The house seemed to exhale along with me. I stepped back, looking around the room, taking in the silence. It felt heavy, but right. The switch was complete. The plan, months in the making, had reached its culmination in this single, careful moment. For a while, I just stood there, hands resting on the edge of the drawer. I thought of Chris, unaware, moving through his evening routine, confident in his secrecy. Every habit, every movement I had observed would now meet its match. The anticipation was sharp, but contained. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. The weight of the act rested with me, solid and real. The house seemed suspended in that quiet. The shadows stretched across the floor, the dust motes drifting like ghosts in the beams of light. I imagined the bottle in his hands later, the moment of confusion, panic, and disbelief when the glue did its work. It was a vision that both unsettled me and steadied me. I left the drawer slightly ajar, just enough to seem untouched, and closed it carefully behind me when I stepped away. The click was final, echoing softly in the garage. The act was sealed, unspoken, permanent. Every step back to the main house felt deliberate. I moved slowly, letting the quiet sink in. The air in the rooms was still, as if the house itself understood the gravity of the night. Even the street outside seemed softer. The occasional rustle of leaves carried gently through the window. In the kitchen, I paused by the counter and set down the tools I had used. My hands tingled from the effort of concentration, but my pulse had slowed. The adrenaline from the careful motions of the swap began to recede. I leaned against the counter for a moment, closing my eyes. Nothing had been spoken. No confrontation had occurred, yet the consequences were already in motion. I thought about the months of observation, the nights I had spent quietly learning his patterns, the internal debates I had fought through. Every moment had led to this. Every choice had prepared me for this calm, precise action. For a moment, I imagined him later, entering the bedroom or bathroom, picking up the bottle without suspicion, the trust he carried into that act turning immediately to shock. The visualization steadied me. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity, a moment where reality and consequence would meet, and no lies could soften the impact. The metaphor of hands and hearts struck me then. My hands were steady, controlled, moving with precision. My heart, though pounding, was quiet in its understanding. The calm of patience had replaced the fire of anger. Every breath, every small movement had been measured. The house echoed with the stillness of preparation and waiting. The drawer closed one final time. My fingers lingered on the wood for a second longer, sealing both the object and the inevitability it carried. I stepped back, letting the shadow shift across the floor, feeling the quiet as an ally.
I left the garage, moving back into the main rooms of the house. Lights remained dim, the streets outside were empty. I made sure everything appeared untouched, ordinary, a life unchanged, waiting for disruption. In the bedroom, I paused at the window, looking out at the dark street, the faint glow of distant lamps. The night seemed longer, stretched by anticipation, and in that stretch, I felt a kind of resolve. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but clarity. The act was done. What followed was inevitable. I moved through the house one last time, checking the locks, the lights, the small spaces where shadows gathered. Everything was in place. The stage was set perfectly. My hands, my choices, my patience. It had all built to this night. And as I lay in bed, the quiet finally settling around me, I understood that the moment was both an ending and a beginning. The bottle rested in the drawer, invisible and deceptive, holding in its small container a truth he could not anticipate. I closed my eyes, the shadows of the room settling across my face. The act was complete. Nothing more could be done. The swap had been executed with precision, with patience, with control. And somewhere in the house, the night waited.
The next morning began like any other. Chris kissed me goodbye, his smile smug and casual, a mask of confidence he wore so easily. "Late meeting," he said, glancing at his phone before leaving. I nodded, careful to keep my face neutral, watching him go out the door without suspicion. His keys jingled, his footsteps faded down the driveway, and the house returned to its quiet. I went about my morning routine, making coffee, unpacking the dishwasher, moving with deliberate calm. There was an unshakable tension beneath the surface, like the quiet before a storm, but I carried on as if nothing had changed. Hours later, my phone began to buzz. Unknown numbers, multiple calls in a short span. I ignored them at first, cleaning and organizing, pretending I hadn't noticed. The calls kept coming, persistent and urgent. Finally, curiosity overcame me and I answered one. "Hello?" My voice was calm, measured. The voice on the other end was frantic, male, unfamiliar. We need to talk about Chris." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone even, though a part of me recognized the tremor in my chest. "It's an emergency," the man said. "We're at the motel, firefighters, they're trying to separate him and—" The word stumbled, and I didn't need the rest to understand. The rest of the day became a blur. Calls kept coming in from different numbers, each one piecing together a story that was both unbelievable and inevitable. Chris had arrived at the motel with her, confident in his secrecy, certain that no one would follow, no one would notice. But the glue had done its work. Firefighters had been called. They had arrived to find two adults physically stuck together, unable to separate without professional help. The scene was chaotic, frantic, and humiliating. The motel staff had been gawking, confused, and alarmed. Emergency lights, sirens, the smell of disinfectant and fear filled the air. Reports circulated quickly. Media coverage followed almost immediately. Cameras capturing snippets, neighbors gossiping, and friends texting each other in disbelief. By the afternoon, the story had spread far beyond the motel, reaching ears that Chris had assumed would never hear. I watched from home, phone in hand, as messages and notifications trickled in. Part of me felt a strange satisfaction. The careful patience, the observation, the months of planning, they had all culminated here. The reality of his arrogance, of his lies, was laid bare in a way he could not deny. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, there was a quiet grief. Not for him,
not even fully for the loss of what I thought we had, but for the part of myself that had hoped differently. The innocence of trust, the comfort of routine, the small moments of laughter and care that had once made our life feel safe. They were gone, irrevocably altered by choices that were never mine. I sat in the quiet of the house, absorbing the chaos that had unfolded miles away. The sounds of the day filtered through the walls, distant traffic, a dog barking, the hum of the refrigerator. It was ordinary, and yet, in sharp contrast, extraordinary. The world outside continued on, unaware that in one motel room, certainty had been shattered and secrets exposed. Friends called later, curious, tentative, unsure what to say. Some joked nervously, others asked questions I didn't answer. The media coverage had framed the story in sensational terms, but I had no interest in narrating the truth to strangers. My story was mine. The lesson was mine. And in the quiet moments that followed, I let the weight of that knowledge settle into my chest. I thought of Chris, of his confusion, his panic, the humiliation of being physically trapped in a situation he had orchestrated for himself. I imagined the firefighters carefully working, tools and patience applied to extricate him, his confidence stripped away piece by piece, and I allowed a small, private sense of vindication, not cruelty, not gloating, but clarity. He had assumed control. He had assumed secrecy. The moment had proven that assumption false. Evenings passed, and the story continued to circulate. Gossip grew in layers, each retelling more elaborate, more incredulous than the last. Yet I remained detached, observing, not needing to participate. The satisfaction lingered quietly, a steady acknowledgement that balance had, in its own strange way, been restored.
And still, I felt grief. Grief for what had been lost, for the life that might have continued differently, for the trust that had been broken not with a single moment, but through the accumulation of countless small lies. I let it coexist with the satisfaction, letting each emotion occupy its space without overwhelming the other. In the following days, I noticed subtle changes in Chris when he returned home. His demeanor was altered, cautious, subdued. He moved differently, spoke less, and the confidence that had once filled the house was replaced with careful observation. He had faced consequences beyond the personal. The exposure had seeped outward, touching the perceptions of friends, coworkers, and neighbors. Through it all, I remained steady. I had acted with patience, precision, and clarity. The aftermath was messy, chaotic, and public, but it was exactly the outcome the situation demanded. I didn't celebrate loudly. I didn't shout. I simply observed, taking in the ripples of truth that spread further than any confrontation could have achieved. And in that observation, I found a strange peace. The house, the routines, the small rituals that had once seemed so ordinary now felt tempered by the knowledge that I had regained control in my own way. The quiet satisfaction was not about cruelty. It was about understanding the boundaries of trust, the consequences of deceit, and the resilience of patience. I allowed myself one final glance at the drawer in the garage, the space that had held the instrument of consequence. Empty now of intrigue, it symbolized more than a bottle replaced with glue. It symbolized preparation, awareness, and the careful cultivation of clarity in a world that had threatened to unravel around me. The chaos at the motel, the frantic phone calls, the sirens, and the exposure, they were all events outside my control. But my own actions, measured and deliberate, had shaped the outcome. That understanding remained with me in the quiet, grounding me in the knowledge that what had occurred was neither accident nor chance. And so, as evening fell, I sat in the living room, the shadows long and soft across the floor, Notifications continued to arrive, messages from friends, from strangers, from the edges of the world I had once assumed were distant. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I simply let the events exist, allowing the satisfaction and grief to coexist in equal measure. It was, in its way, a kind of closure. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady. A realization that patience, observation, and calculated action could alter the trajectory of a situation in ways that raw emotion never could. And somewhere in the house, the quiet persisted, a reminder that life moves on, that consequences ripple outward, and that clarity often arrives through observation, patience, and courage. That same night, after the chaos had unfolded miles away, the house felt heavier than ever. The shadows seemed to stretch longer across the floors, the quiet deeper, almost expectant. I moved slowly through the rooms, surveying the spaces that had once felt like home. The living room, where we had laughed over small jokes. The kitchen, where mornings had begun with coffee and routine. The bedroom, now silent and hollow. Everything was the same, yet everything had changed. I carried a small bag, just enough for the essentials. Clothes, toiletries, a few personal items. I didn't take more than I needed. The act was deliberate. I wasn't running. I wasn't fleeing in panic. I was choosing. No confrontation, no explanations. Not to him, not to anyone. The words I could have shouted, the accusations I could have thrown, felt unnecessary. He had already learned the consequences of his choices, had been exposed in a way he couldn't undo. My departure was not meant to punish him further. It was meant to reclaim my life. I paused in the kitchen, glancing at the counter where our mornings had begun. Coffee mugs, neat and untouched, caught the dim glow from the street lamp outside. I remembered the ritual, the small comfort of routine, and allowed myself a quiet smile. A memory, fleeting, but mine to keep. The bag in my hands felt light, but it carried the weight of decision. I moved through the hallway slowly, avoiding creaks in the floor, listening for sounds that weren't there. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. I opened the door to the garage, checking once more that the drawer remained undisturbed, that the stage for the morning had been left intact. Everything was in its place. My careful planning, my patience, my observations, they had been precise, deliberate. I stepped outside into the night. The air was cool. The faint scent of damp leaves carried from the street. The quiet of the neighborhood contrasted sharply with the chaos that had occurred earlier. Firefighters, sirens, exposure, those events felt like they belonged to another world now. This was my world, the one I was choosing. I paused at the front door, hand on the handle. I looked back at the house, the spaces that had been filled with routine, love, and now secrecy. The shadows cast by the lamplight stretched across the porch, highlighting the threshold I was about to cross. With a slow, deliberate motion, I closed the door behind me. The click echoed softly in the night, final, deliberate. I didn't linger. I didn't look for signs of him, didn't imagine his reaction, didn't allow myself to dwell on anger or sorrow. I moved forward, each step away from the house a step toward myself. The bag at my side was more than a collection of belongings. It was a symbol of autonomy, of choosing my path over the life that had become a trap. The street was quiet, the shadows long. I walked with measured steps, aware of each movement, each breath. The decision I had made in silence and observation now felt tangible. I was no longer a part of the chaos, no longer tethered to the deceit and betrayal.
The night, the darkness, the empty houses around me, they all witnessed the quiet reclamation of my life. As I continued down the street, I reflected on the months that had led to this moment. The initial signs, subtle and almost imperceptible, missed calls, vague excuses, small shifts in behavior. The receipts, the texts, the careful planning and observation, each fragment had brought me here to a moment where I could act with clarity, patience, and purpose. The emotional weight of it pressed against me, not in waves of panic, but in quiet layers of realization. I had been observant, patient, deliberate. I had not allowed my emotions to dictate my actions. The swap, the chaos, the exposure, it had all unfolded as planned. And now, the choice to leave was the final act of autonomy. I didn't know where I would go or what awaited me on the path ahead, but that uncertainty felt liberating rather than frightening. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the clarity of making a choice for myself rather than reacting to the actions of another. The silence of the house behind me, the weight of the night around me, the cool air brushing my skin, they all emphasized that this was mine to shape. As the neighborhood receded in the distance, the porch light fading behind me, I allowed a deep breath to fill my lungs. There was no turning back. The house was behind me, quiet and empty. The drawer in the garage, the bottle of glue, the consequences, they all remained. A reminder of the culmination of patience and observation. I moved forward, step by step, carrying the quiet satisfaction of having acted with precision, but also the sober knowledge of loss. The emotional spectrum was complex. There was satisfaction, relief, grief, and an undeniable sense of newfound strength. The night stretched ahead, open and uncharted. Each step into it felt like a reclamation of agency. I had chosen myself. I had chosen clarity over chaos, patience over impulse, autonomy over destruction. The streetlights passed overhead, casting long, moving shadows. I walked in silence, letting the darkness guide my path. The house was behind me, empty and still, and for the first time in a long time, I was free to define the next chapter.
I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The house, the chaos, the man who had once been part of my life, it was all behind the closed door. The quiet finality of that click echoed in my mind, a subtle punctuation to the months of observation, reflection, and patience. By the time I reached the end of the street, I was fully aware that I had left not just a house, but a life that no longer served me. The bag I carried was light, but heavy with significance. It held more than clothes and toiletries. It carried the proof of strength, the evidence of careful planning, and the quiet assertion that my life would now be guided by my choices alone. The night carried me forward. Each step reaffirmed that leaving was not escape, but reclamation, not vengeance, but assertion. The emptiness of the house behind me contrasted with the fullness of agency and awareness I now held. As I disappeared into the quiet streets, the house faded from view. The door closed, the shadows settled, and the night carried my footsteps onward. The path ahead was unknown, but it was mine to navigate. And in that stillness, walking away from the remnants of a life built on secrecy, lies, and careful observation, I finally felt the weight of freedom. The house was empty. The door was shut. The past remained behind me and the future awaited. Quiet, open, and entirely my own.
Weeks had passed since I left. Weeks filled with quiet roads, empty highways, and the soft rhythm of life that was entirely my own. I found a cabin 2 towns over, tucked between pine trees, far enough from the familiar streets to feel like a new beginning. The first time I saw it, the sun was low in the sky, scattering gold across the wooden siding. The porch smelled faintly of cedar, the air crisp and untouched. I parked the car, bag still in the back seat, and took a slow step onto the porch. No one watched me. No one waited. No one expected anything from me. It was a simple house, but it felt enormous in its freedom. I walked through the rooms, each creak of the floorboards a note of permission. Permission to breathe, to unpack, to take back a sense of self that had been buried under months of observation, planning, and pain. Mornings here became my sanctuary. The first light of day seeped through the windows, brushing across the kitchen table where I would pour coffee into a mug I had chosen myself. There was no rush, no phone buzzing with demands, no reminder of a life that had been fractured by lies. The silence was a balm, carrying neither accusation nor expectation. I would sit on the porch, watching the sun rise over the trees, each branch catching the light in a way that seemed deliberate, almost tender. The air was filled with quiet, broken only by the occasional crow or distant rustle of leaves. I learned the rhythm of this place, the way time seemed slower and more deliberate. I learned how to move without thinking about him, without scanning for signs or clues. And yet, echoes of the past reached me occasionally. A number flashed on my phone, a familiar one. Chris. My chest tightened for a fraction of a second, and then I let it pass. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He had already faced the consequences of his choices. His panic, his humiliation, his exposure had played out without my interference. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to confront.
I spent the afternoons exploring trails that wound through the woods behind the cabin. Sunlight sifted through the leaves, painting patterns on the dirt path. I walked slowly, intentionally, noticing the small details I had missed in life before. The smell of pine needles crushed underfoot, the cool whisper of wind across the stream, the way sunlight caught the ripples in water. Each observation reminded me that life was broader than the confines of betrayal, that there was space to breathe, space to heal, space to rediscover what it meant to exist on my own terms. Evenings were quiet, framed by the slow descent of the sun. I would sit in the rocking chair on the porch, a blanket draped across my lap, watching the sky shift through oranges, pinks, and purples. The colors mirrored the pace of my own recovery, slow, layered, gradual. Shadows stretched across the cabin walls, yet the darkness felt protective, not menacing. It was a reminder that some parts of the past could remain behind me, absorbed into memory, leaving only lessons and clarity. I began to notice small things I had forgotten about myself. Laughter at simple jokes on the radio, satisfaction in cooking without expectation, the calm that comes from moving through space, unobserved, unmeasured. Independence became tangible, not just a concept. I could make decisions for myself, follow whims, pause when I wanted, stay quiet when I wanted. Life felt like mine in a way it hadn't in years. Chris called occasionally. Sometimes I saw his name light up the screen. The first few times, my fingers hovered, almost unconsciously, but I never answered. The urge to confront, to explain, to reclaim a narrative had vanished. It was no longer mine to manage. The moment I had waited for, the clarity of consequence, had already arrived. I had already won. The cabin became a symbol, not just of escape, but of reclamation. Each morning I poured coffee, each sunset I watched, each trail I explored. It all reminded me that life continued, not perfectly, not without scars, but without the weight of secrecy, lies, and manipulation. My decisions were my own. My space was mine, and the quiet satisfaction of autonomy
anchored me firmly in the present. I thought about the months of preparation, observation, and patience, the drawer, the bottle, the careful switch, the chaos at the motel. It had all led to this quiet moment. The satisfaction was not loud, not theatrical. It didn't need to be. It existed in the rhythm of my days, in the calm acceptance of the house behind me and the freedom before me.
Night after night, I watched the stars emerge over the trees. The sky stretched endlessly, filled with constellations that had no claim on me. The air was crisp, the night quiet, and I felt the steady pulse of independence in my chest. I didn't need vengeance anymore. I didn't need to watch or track. I had acted with patience, precision, and clarity. That was enough. Sometimes I spoke aloud to myself, quietly, a reflection on months of tension, observation, and action. I would say, I have already won. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't triumph in a traditional sense. It was a statement of fact. The chaos, the humiliation, the exposure, they had happened. The world had shifted in a way that no longer required my interference. And in that clarity, I felt relief. The cabin, the trees, the long evenings of quiet and reflection, they carried me through a process I hadn't known I needed. I allowed myself to acknowledge the pain, the disappointment, the small losses along the way, and I let it coexist with the growing strength, the regained autonomy, the small victories that were mine alone. Mornings became sacred. Coffee, sunlight, quiet observation of the world outside my window. Afternoons became explorations, trails, streams, and the rustle of leaves. Evenings were reflection, watching the sky change, the air grow cooler, and the shadows settle. And through it all, Chris faded into the past. Calls ignored, messages unseen, a life behind me that no longer demanded attention. I had learned patience. I had learned observation. I had learned how to act decisively, deliberately, and then step back. And now, in this cabin, far from the streets and secrets of my old life, I was learning healing. Freedom, I realized, wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and deliberate. It was waking without expectation, moving without permission, deciding without compromise. It was the absence of chaos, the presence of clarity, the slow return of trust in oneself. I watched the sun dip below the horizon one evening, casting long orange shadows across the cabin porch. The air was still, the quiet, comforting. I took a deep breath, letting the day settle inside me. The past had happened. The consequences had unfolded, and now I existed entirely on my own terms. I didn't need to call him back. I didn't need to revisit the past. I had acted with precision, patience, and clarity, and that action had carried me here, to quiet mornings, open skies, and sunsets that belonged entirely to me. I had already won. The days after the motel incident were different for him. Though I was no longer present to witness them directly, word traveled fast. Social circles buzzed with disbelief. Neighbors whispered. Colleagues exchanged hurried text messages. And friends who once saw him as confident now looked at him with thinly veiled amusement. The story hit the internet first, a small piece in a local news outlet. Couples stuck together. Firefighters called to motel. His name was mentioned. The images weren't graphic, but the description of the scene left little to imagination. Two adults immobilized, firefighters intervening, the awkwardness of an act meant to be private. Everything had leaked into public view. I didn't follow it obsessively, but glimpses reached me through notifications. Headlines, links shared by friends, stray mentions in group chats. And each one told the same story. Chris had been exposed. Completely.
There was no hiding, no pretending. The confidence he carried out the door each morning had dissolved into something brittle and fragile. The humiliation was not confined to strangers or casual acquaintances. Within his workplace, whispers carried further than he could control. Colleagues who had once respected him with polite nods now exchanged sidelong glances. Meetings were uncomfortable, introductions awkward. Even professional credibility began to waver. Minor errors were noted more sharply, jokes fell flat, and casual mistakes drew attention. The careful persona he had cultivated unraveled quietly, steadily, almost inevitably, and the personal consequences followed swiftly. His mistress, faced with the reality of public exposure and the awkwardness of their private encounters becoming public spectacle, left him. The calls, the messages, the small attempts to explain or justify himself went unanswered. She was gone, and the secret he had tried to preserve was laid bare. The very person who had been complicit in his deception vanished from his life, leaving a vacuum he hadn't anticipated. I observed all this from the distance of my new life. I didn't rejoice in his downfall. There was no need. The consequences had unfolded naturally, as they always would when deception met exposure. I felt neither triumph nor malice. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of separation, a recognition that his story was no longer entwined with mine.
Each piece of news, each whisper, each glimpse of his faltering confidence reinforced a single truth. His actions had consequences, and I had removed myself from the web of his decisions. The embarrassment, the social fallout, the loss of relationships, these were events that belonged entirely to him now. Even as his world seemed to crumble, mine remained steady. The cabin, the mornings, the quiet trails through the woods, all of it reinforced the boundary I had established. His mistakes no longer threatened my peace. His panic and humiliation played out in headlines and whispers, while I moved through space unobserved, unmeasured, untouched by the chaos he had created for himself. I allowed myself to reflect on the contrast. In the past, our lives had been intertwined. Every secret, every choice affecting both of us. Now, the separation was absolute. I watched the ripple of consequences from afar, aware of the gravity of his situation, but unaffected by it. The clarity of my own choices became more pronounced with each passing day. There was a certain justice in the unfolding events, not the kind dictated by law or revenge, but the natural outcome of his actions meeting reality. The humiliation, the professional decline, the social awkwardness, all of it was proportional to the risks he had taken and the secrecy he had maintained. I didn't engineer it beyond the swap. I simply acted once, deliberately, and then let the consequences follow their course. His name became a quiet punchline in social circles, a cautionary tale for those who believed confidence and secrecy could prevent exposure. I heard fragments from friends who had received forwarded articles or gossip. They laughed, incredulous at the details. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. Observing from a distance, the narrative unfolded without interference. Meanwhile, I continued my mornings in the cabin, the quiet ritual of coffee and sunlight. The world outside moved, stories spread, reputations shifted, and he navigated the fallout without me. I could feel the distance in a tangible way, a solid separation that brought an odd combination of relief and understanding.
I thought about the months that had led to this point, the subtle shifts in behavior, the missed calls, the receipts, the patient observation, and finally, the deliberate swap. Each choice I had made reinforced a single principle. My story would not be dictated by his mistakes or lies.
My narrative was mine to shape. And now, watching him falter from afar, I understood fully that the past belonged to him. The embarrassment, the exposure, the loss of relationships, they were all pieces of his life. I did not carry them with me. They were not mine to manage, not mine to resolve, and not mine to endure. Even the occasional media snippet or forwarded message, though tempting to engage with, remained in the realm of observation. I allowed myself only a brief acknowledgement, a small mental note that the consequences had been realized. Beyond that, I did not dwell. I had chosen a life of quiet independence, free from the chaos he had invited. The mistress leaving him marked another turning point. It was the final, irreversible consequence of the choices he had made. Someone who had been part of his secret world was gone. He could not recreate the past, could not undo the public exposure, and could not reclaim the privacy he had once assumed was under his control. The ripple effects were complete. I thought about the lessons embedded in all of this. Observation, patience, deliberate action. These were the tools that allowed me to disengage from his chaos while ensuring that consequences aligned with the reality of his choices. I hadn't needed to orchestrate every detail. I had simply acted with precision once and let the natural course of events complete the story. Even as his reputation suffered and his social connections shifted, I moved through quiet mornings, gentle sunsets, and trails through the woods that were untouched by the upheaval. The separation between our lives was absolute. The space I had carved out for myself, the deliberate steps I had taken, had created a buffer that insulated me from any lingering effect of his humiliation. And in that quiet, reflective space, I repeated to myself a simple truth. That was his story, not mine anymore. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a triumph in the traditional sense. It was clarity. Recognition that the weight of consequence had been transferred to him entirely. My narrative was no longer intertwined with his mistakes, no longer dictated by his actions. The past belonged to him. The consequences were his, and the future, my future, remained open, quiet, and mine alone. I allowed myself to look at the distant tree line, the soft glow of the sunset, the shadows that stretched across the cabin porch. The day carried on as it always did. The ripple of his actions continued elsewhere, while I existed in the rhythm of my own life, untouched by the chaos he had created. Even the occasional call, the occasional forwarded news link, the occasional whisper in a social circle could not penetrate the separation I had established. He faced the fallout. I faced freedom. The contrast was quiet, but undeniable. And in that quiet, I found a new definition of victory. Not in humiliation, not in exposure, not in public ridicule, but in clarity, in detachment, and in the knowledge that my life was no longer governed by his mistakes. I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the light fade over the trees. The wind rustled softly, carrying the scent of pine and the cool evening air. Everything was steady. Everything was mine, and I let the understanding settle fully. His story, with all its public consequences, was entirely his. I had already moved beyond it. The ripple of his downfall would continue to spread. The humiliation would echo in small circles, and the social consequences would unfold in layers over time. I did not need to witness them all. I did not need to react. My part had been played, my choices deliberate, my actions precise, and now the outcome belonged entirely to him. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the quiet of the cabin wash over me. The sun had set completely now, and the stars began to emerge. The rhythm of night and the peace of my space reminded me that life moves forward, that consequences reach those who deserve them, and that freedom can be found in observation, patience, and deliberate action. Chris's story continued. Public, awkward, irreversible. Mine was calm, deliberate, and intact. The distinction was stark and unshakable. That was his story, not mine anymore.
The months that followed created a sharp contrast between our lives. His world had become small, crowded with humiliation, public attention, and fractured trust. Every interaction was tinged with uncertainty, every meeting shadowed by the memory of exposure. The events at the motel, the chaos, the firefighters, those images had been burned into the minds of anyone who had witnessed or heard of them. His world, once steady and confident, had become a careful navigation of consequences. And yet, from my side, life had grown wide, open, and deliberate. The cabin, nestled between trees and quiet streets, became a sanctuary of clarity. Mornings brought sunlight through the windows, spilling across the wooden floor, casting patterns that shifted slowly with time. The air carried a sense of calm, unbroken by deception or manipulation. I watched the world move outside the cabin, the distant roads, passing cars, and occasional glimpses of neighbors. Life flowed steadily, predictable yet peaceful, a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. I had built this life carefully, piece by piece. Observation, patience, and deliberate action had allowed me to reclaim control. The contrast between our paths was undeniable. Where his had narrowed into chaos and embarrassment, mine had expanded into quiet autonomy. Reflection became a daily practice. I considered the months of tension, the small discoveries, the planning, and the swap that had precipitated the fallout. Each choice, deliberate and precise, had carried a weight that now felt both heavy and light. Heavy for the responsibility I had carried alone, light because I had acted with clarity and without fury. I hadn't needed to yell, to confront, or to retaliate with chaos. My silence had been deliberate. My patience had been strategic. Betrayal, I realized, was not merely the loss of trust. It was the erosion of peace. The insidious change of routines, the hidden actions, the small lies, they all chipped away at calm, certainty, and stability. The moments of quiet in the house had been filled with tension I could not shake. But by observing, acting carefully, and then stepping away, I had reclaimed my peace in a way that fury never could have achieved. The evenings in the cabin were particularly restorative. Sunsets painted the sky with vibrant oranges, reds, and purples, each one a reminder of the beauty that existed beyond the chaos of past weeks. I would sit on the porch with a blanket across my lap, coffee steaming in my hands, and simply watch the day fade. Shadows stretched long across the porch, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Each detail was a grounding force, a reminder that I had chosen my path, that life had slowed to a pace I could control. Sometimes memories of him or the motel incident would cross my mind. I did not chase them, did not dwell on them, did not allow anger or humiliation to return. The chaos he had created for himself had played out in full, and it was no longer my responsibility. The story, the fallout, the consequences, they were his. I observed in quiet acknowledgement, detached, aware, and satisfied that the equilibrium had been restored. The lesson was clear. Revenge was not always a matter of fury or confrontation. Sometimes it was patience. Sometimes it was observation. Sometimes it was simply allowing the natural consequences to unfold, while stepping away and preserving one's own clarity. I had not sought to destroy him through words or spectacle. I had acted precisely, deliberately,
and then allowed life to carry the outcome forward. In that measured approach, I found the quietest form of satisfaction. I thought often about the moment the swap was executed, the hands steady, the heart deliberate, the house silent. That act, performed with precision and patience, had rippled outward to create consequences far beyond immediate observation. The chaos at the motel, the firefighters, the exposure, it had all occurred without further intervention. My role had been singular, deliberate, and complete. In contrast, the months I had spent observing, waiting, and planning had taught me that power lay in quiet action. The appearance of calm, the patience to wait for the right moment, the deliberate application of choice. These were more effective than any shout, confrontation, or dramatic display. Silence, I realized, carried its own weight. It demanded attention without drawing unnecessary focus to oneself.
The mornings in the cabin, the sunlight filtering through trees, the crisp air, and the gentle creaking of the floorboards as I moved through the rooms, these were reminders that autonomy, peace, and clarity were worth far more than temporary satisfaction. I had regained control of my life. I had reclaimed my space. I had preserved my future. Occasionally, his name appeared in media snippets, forwarded messages, or the odd conversation with someone familiar. I acknowledged it quietly, observing the ripple, noting the consequences, and then returned to my routine. It was no longer my narrative. It no longer demanded my intervention. Where his life had become small, constrained, and fragile, mine had grown wide, free, and deliberate. The contrast became a constant subtle companion. In the evenings, I would watch the sunset, thinking of the chaos that had once surrounded him. The vivid colors, the calm air, and the silence of the trees reminded me of the distance between us, not just physically, but emotionally. The gap had widened in the months since the swap, and it had become a space of clarity, reflection, and deliberate choice. I realized that true resolution comes not from loud acts, not from shouting or confrontation, but from measured, deliberate action and the decision to step away. The most potent form of justice had been patience. The most effective form of revenge had been observation, calculation, and the ability to preserve one's own peace. Even as night fell, stars emerging over the dark treetops, I felt the quiet weight of freedom settle around me. The wind brushed softly across the cabin, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. The house was silent. My mind was steady. My life was my own. And then I acknowledged the final truth of it. Sometimes the most powerful act is not to confront, not to fight, not to react. Sometimes it is to walk away, to leave space for consequences to occur naturally, to reclaim one's own life, one's own clarity, and one's own peace.
The contrast could not have been clearer. He had been pulled apart physically and socially by the consequences of his actions. His world had narrowed, constrained by public exposure, humiliation, and loss. My world had expanded, open and deliberate, marked by quiet mornings, trails through the woods, and evenings watching the sun fade beyond the horizon. And so I reflected quietly, one final time, letting the awareness settle fully. The chaos, the exposure, the humiliation, they had all unfolded. I had acted deliberately once and then stepped away. I had preserved my life, my clarity, my peace. The distance between us had become absolute. The final thought was simple, unadorned yet weighty. They had to pull him apart to set him free. But me, I walked away on my own. The cabin remained quiet, the air still. The shadows shifted gently as the night deepened. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of independence and the soft echo of deliberate choice. The past was behind me. The consequences belonged to him, and my life
was entirely my own.
If this story kept you watching, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of betrayal and resilience. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight?